Welcome, everyone, to Ask a Left Nietzschean on Acid Horizon, a show where we discuss the concepts and controversies surrounding Nietzsche's work and politics. Joining us on the show today are Justin and Devin. And if you've been following us for some time, perhaps you remember we did a show with Justin last summer on the work of Nietzsche and its relationship to education. Also with us, we have a newcomer, Devin, whom I discovered on Twitter due to the fact that his handle is in fact Left Nietzschean, which strangely was not the namesake of this podcast, but his appearance on the social media feed was serendipitous. I want to give both of you a chance to offer your own introduction. Justin, perhaps you could first reintroduce yourself and talk about what you do, and maybe let us know if there's anything new going on in your life, reading, or research.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Good to be back. My name is Justin, at non-pedagogy on Twitter, if you want to follow me there. Yeah, I'm an early childhood teacher in Texas, working in the public school system. So I also do a lot of reading of Nietzsche and Nietzsche-related, which you can learn more about if you listen to the other episode. But as for what's been going on recently, not too much different. I just got on summer break. Excited to talk to you guys. Always exciting to talk Nietzsche and do that from the left for me. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Justin. And as I understand it, Devin, you have your PhD in philosophy, political philosophy. And as you introduce yourself, could you talk about your work, your dissertation, and anything else that you would like to have us know?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me on, Craig. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think this will be a great discussion. Yeah, I did my PhD in political theory. My dissertation was focused on kind of the problem of political judgment, specifically in the context of critical theory and Frankfurt School critical theory particularly. And I was interested in the questions of the normative foundations of critical theory. What are the kind of metaphysical, epistemological grounds upon which we're making the kind of moral judgments, normative judgments we make when we criticize forms of political power? And Nietzsche very much figures in here as somebody that the Frankfurt School is engaged with, and also somebody who just offers profound reflections on kind of the foundations of morality, or potentially the lack thereof. So I elected not to go along the path of academic jobs. I'm working at a law firm at present, but also working on writing. And my current project is on Nietzsche and madness, basically trying to dig into Nietzsche's experience of mental illness, not just with his breakdown towards the end of his life, but really throughout his life, how that figures into his philosophy, and how that allows us to kind of develop an idea of reason that is always situated in relation to a conception of madness as potentially a limit of reason, potentially something that reason is productively a kind of productive adversary of reason, or something that goes to the very heart of reason. So that kind of brings in my own experiences with mental illness, and is kind of going to be a philosophical, psychological exploration.
Awesome. Thank you very much. For this show, we tapped our patrons and many of our followers for a robust list of questions, of which we may or may get to the entire list. We don't know, but given that there's a significant overlap between many of the questions that were submitted, I hope that we cover a lot of the ground that has been laid out before us. And also, if we have time, we may be pulling some questions from those who are listening live. So as we move forward with the discussion, feel free to submit your thoughtful thoughts in the chat. Also, we're going to presume that listeners have at least a little bit of knowledge of Nietzsche's work, but we'll begin with a question that I think will address a theme that recurs quite frequently in Nietzsche's writing. And actually, that question comes from Adam. So Adam, take it away.
Okay, so my question really is about one of the sort of central themes I think that resonates for a lot of Nietzsche's work, particularly his ideas of affirmation, affirming the eternal return, which is a particular kind of relationship to how he thinks about, our relationship to time. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he says, one of the biggest follies of the human condition is our propensity towards revenge. And what revenge means, in a way, is a kind of an attempt to will backwards. It's as if we can will away the past because we could not overcome it, or we could not simply stop it from happening. And this manifests with Nietzsche as a kind of a grand psychology of the things that produce revenge and the kind of value systems that, for example, that rise from a culture of revenge. This is what he says in The Genealogy of Morals. But equally, his critique account of Christianity generally is a kind of revenge against death itself, whereas for him, Christ is actually a sort of figure who affirms death, takes on all life upon him. Now, I just wanted to ask how this critique of revenge stands in relation to its political import. I mean, what's wrong about revenge, or even maybe retribution, if Nietzsche would say that most of our theories of justice are actually secretly theories of revenge? Because the question of retribution or revenge or reversing or politically having a political will which reverses aspects of the past is a very key aspect in discourses around abolitionism, critiques of carceral politics, and of course wider discussions about stuff like reparations and the like, and repairing the damage done, repairing damage done by empire, by political and fascist and capitalist systems on the people who they attack. So I just wanted to ask what you both thought about this idea of revenge, and particularly Nietzsche's critique of it in the political sense.
Great. Since we have Devin as the newcomer, Devin, why don't you tackle that first, then we'll go to Justin.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is a great question and really an excellent starting point for kind of digging into Nietzsche's importance as a political thinker. And Adam, I think you're getting at a couple important issues. The first is a question of, call it the metaphysics of revenge, the way that revenge is related to a certain conception of time, an attempt to will backwards or erase a painful past experience. And that is, closely related to Nietzsche's entire effort to base his philosophy upon becoming, on a kind of active, productive concept of existence and life. And then I think the other reason that it's interesting to get into is that while Nietzsche takes movements that are fighting for justice, such as socialism, as kind of his paradigmatic example of resentment in his time, it's kind of flipped, I think, in our time, where we are offered with very obvious examples on the far right of demagogues, ideologues who are driven, it seems, predominantly by resentment, even to the point where they're willing to kind of come out and say, well, we're really about negating or destroying our enemy. We don't have a positive vision on our own. And so I think, in the first case, I think you're asking a really good question about whether the past and, correcting the past ought to enter into our considerations of justice. And I think the answer is clearly that it should. And here we're going to get into questions of, how far down the road with Nietzsche's kind of quest to affirm the eternal recurrence do we really want to go from a political standpoint? His idea of the eternal recurrence seems to embrace necessity, fate. Everything is kind of connected in universal determinism. In politics, it seems like we're often committed to ideas of agency, ideas of freedom that are kind of part of practical reason. And so I think there's always going to be a productive tension here. But I think that what Nietzsche's lesson essentially is for the political left in this respect is twofold. One, he's providing both a psychology and a kind of philosophical reconstruction of both how revenge is in some ways self-undermining, how it serves to intensify the kind of pain and suffering that it is initially responding to, that drives it. And it's also going to be unable to create positive values in some fashion. And I think the kind of overriding concern with affirmation is something that kind of has to be situated in our understanding of revolutionary discourse, our understanding of the kind of emancipatory ideal. And there's a question that I think Nietzsche is posing of, well, what is it that we're affirming positively, right? Are we simply affirming revolution from a negative standpoint? Are we just trying to smash capitalism, just trying to smash the state? Or are we, whether psychologically or in terms of how we justify ourselves, driven primarily by a positive, perhaps utopian vision of kind of what goods an emancipated society could achieve that our, oppressed society is unable to achieve right now? And I think that Nietzsche still offers really valuable lessons in this respect, both as a way of kind of orienting utopian hopes on the left, and then, in addition, as a critique of kind of the left's current political opponents, the Jordan Petersons of the world, who are so deeply driven by resentment out of an urge to protect a kind of traditional identity they feel is threatened, that it really consumes the entirety of their politics. So in that respect, I think it animates a lot of dynamics in kind of left and right politics today.
Great, thanks. Justin, I'm going to fold in the question that was posed directly to Justin on this, since I think it cuts so close to the question we just attempted to answer. It said, Justin once tweeted, capitalism is built on ressentiment, bad conscience, and the ascetic ideal. It is a Christian war machine. Please explain that. Maybe you can kind of combine those two things, since revenge is the topic right now.
Yeah, sure. Well, I will try. But that tweet especially is, for me, when I was in school, I did a lot of work on Max Weber. So that tweet is me very much like tying in Nietzsche's sort of psychological critiques of the Western philosophy and running that right through like the Protestant work ethic and, the birth of capitalism. So just thinking about how, I think when you think about, what you think of Calvinism, that type of Protestantism, where it's like combines the ascetic ideal of these things are not for my own, enjoyment. This is like destiny given to me by God, and it's proved through my acts. I don't spend any of this money on myself. The bad conscience of and the reason that I don't do that is because it's my fault. That I am this guilty person that carries this sort of infinite debt. And I also have this level of resentment that it's your fault. The rejection of this relationship between the self and the world, and that type of thing. And I think that going back to, the original question, I think it's important to think about for Nietzsche, this idea of revenge versus the idea of attack. Because he's never saying don't sort of go after your enemies in some way, whoever those enemies are. I think it's important that we determine who the correct enemies are. I think that's a big thing for Nietzsche, but it's important that we're, instead of doing it from a revenge standpoint, that we're doing it from an attack standpoint. And I think that depends a lot on, Deleuze really hones in on this active versus reactive forces in the body. And I think that it's important to remember that I think that for Nietzsche, if you're attacking, it's like a bodily force, will through you that is not being represented in some way. And then when you're looking into the past, you're automatically representing your enemies. You're representing these things that you're fighting against. And by doing that, you're staying in this reactive space versus this active space, which is going to, as Devin was pointing out, reproduce a lot of the same both psychological states and political states that you're attempting to fight against. Maybe those things are reversed. Maybe somebody else is on top and somebody's on the bottom, but you're still kind of reproducing this master-slave relationship with all of these concomitant problems that come along with it for Nietzsche. And I think that not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I think thinking about things like that in terms of what Deleuze and Guattari call minor politics, is useful, where it's if you're given these cramped spaces and there's this bodily will to overcome these cramped spaces, you're going to produce attacks. You're going to produce something pushing yourself or pushing the group of people that you identify with towards something like a revolution or something like freedom that you want to go towards. It doesn't have to be in the sense of playing the game of representation that will keep you sort of trapped in that way. I think that you can reach that point of fighting against your slavery through these sort of Nietzschean techniques versus recommitting yourself to all of these things that he's critiquing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Devin. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up, I think, particularly on the point about Deleuze and Guattari, because I think that we'd probably agree that the central or the richest kind of treatment of these themes is the genealogy of morals. In the first essay is where, we get a clear breakdown of these kind of two types of moral valuation that he describes as master and slave morality. Typically try to avoid those kinds of terms, but the contrast, I think, between types of moral valuations is important. And I think one way that this kind of relates to the discussion is that I think it shifts the emphasis away from the content or the specific content of the ideals themselves that we are advocating. So we're shifting to a question of why we're motivated to accept certain ideals, what forms of reasoning we're engaging with, and whether ultimately kind of were driven by a need to affirm life, or a kind of fatigue or sadness at life, a desire to negate life. And I think it's important to kind of learn the dynamics of moral valuation that Nietzsche sketches out in the genealogy as a contrast between a kind of affirmative morality that starts with some kind of value that is taken to be creative, productive, and then kind of derives as a kind of contrast from that an idea of what is bad as what detracts from this primarily affirmative identity or primary affirmative value. And the contrast is a morality that focuses on identifying an enemy, and then identifies itself as good as a contrast with the identified enemy. And I think what you'll see is that Nietzsche uses these different types of moral valuations in many different contexts to deconstruct and reconstruct many different types of moral ideals. And I think what that means is that there's always going to be some kind of tension between the moral philosophy that Nietzsche's given us, the picture of morality that Nietzsche's given us, and the particular judgment that Nietzsche himself draws as a political philosopher of his time, and how he applies those to the institutions of his time, which he does recognize is quite different than, the time a century or two from his writing that he anticipates might be ripe for his work, right? And so I think that's an important distinction to draw, and it's where we can say, well, look, when we examine our belief in justice, our fight for justice is really inspired by revenge, or is there an affirmative ideal of emancipation really at work there? Was Nietzsche wrong to identify that as kind of the primary source of resentment in politics, rather than, say, an aristocratic grievance politics that tries to restore a position of lost privilege, for example? So I think trying to calibrate those forms of evaluation with the present, rather than just imitating Nietzsche's own judgments, is an important element of engaging with them here.
Great, thanks, Devin. I want to bring Will into the discussion, particularly the idea that Nietzsche's ideas are useful in terms of achieving a kind of utopian project. Will works with Foucault quite a bit, and for whom Nietzsche was an incredible mediator. Do you have a response to that? Like, where do you see Nietzsche's role, for example, in the scope or realm of destituent politics? Is Nietzsche merely a constituent thinker, or is there a destituent capacity to his thought? Is he useful in any regard to the politics that you cleave to?
Yeah, I'm going to be pretty controversial and say no.
Okay.
Like, that's the function of the eternal return, right? Is to show precisely that power can't be grounded in that way. Right, the relationship between, for example, like, let's say, in the same way, this is the same kind of approach to, let's say, sexual liberation politics. It says one day sex will be good again, right? And I think the function of, say, Nietzsche's, I think the function of Nietzsche's eternal return is, in a sense, something that needs to be tapped into here. But at the same time, I think Devin is entirely right to say that what is so powerful in Nietzsche is not perhaps necessarily the particularity of given theses, right? That's not really the strength of Nietzsche. If the Nietzsche you're trying to find is just a cultural critic, then that's fine, right? Like, Contra Wagner is fascinating for that reason, if you need a good critique of, like, the Ritornello or something like that, right? But the strength of Nietzsche is to be found precisely in his approach to the question of history, in his approach to the question of historical singularity, continuity. And I think that for that reason, Nietzsche's project is always self-revising, right? So just if you simply just look at the difference between the representation of Dionysus in, or no, let's be more specific here. If you look at the representation of the relationship between the Apollonian and the Dionysian in, say, some of the passages of the Gay Science or Ecce Homo, right? What happens between these two periods is that Nietzsche finds a fundamental flaw at the core of the birth of tragedy, which is oppositional thinking, right? And oppositional thinking haunts Nietzsche, that allows for a dialectical history to creep back in, which allows for what? A historical continuity that Nietzsche's allergic to, right? And what does that come down to? The cosmic reality of the eternal return for Nietzsche. Now, we can have a debate about whether or not Nietzsche actually believes in the cosmic reality of the eternal return. But I think that when it comes to the particularity of Nietzsche's politics, like we have to, for example, Nietzsche not being a particular fan of, say, the French Revolution, right? We have to move beyond simple, vulgar, particular readings of Nietzsche and start to actually get to the core of his metaphysics there, in a way that I think certain discussions that Foucault had with Maoists in the 70s did. There's a huge bridge between Foucault and Nietzsche on the question of the replication of bourgeois justice at the heart of the French Revolution. And in fact, like revolutionary psychology or French revolutionary psychology makes possible what we will consider bourgeois justice in the 19th century, right? So I think that when it comes to, a relationship between Nietzsche and the French Nietzscheans, Foucault is different. Like Foucault is not like Klossowski. Foucault is not like Deleuze. Foucault's not engaging with Nietzsche at the level of the metaphysical. Foucault has a much more methodological, historical relationship to Nietzsche. That doesn't mean that, there aren't elements of the rest of Nietzsche's work that I think resonate deeply with some of the political commitments of Foucault. And I think that's why maybe Foucault's comment in Italy, when he was like, I'm not really a Nietzsche of Zarathustra, I'm more of a Nietzsche of the Birth of Tragedy and the Untimely Meditations. I think Foucault's missing out on certain elements that constitute what Foucault will call the threshold of modernity, particularly the biopolitical, that exist in Nietzsche's account of that which makes small, right? Which I think that which makes small is a remarkable account of the beginning of physiocratic biopolitical modernity. But I think that the strength that Foucault saw in Nietzsche was to subject philosophy to the very thing it wanted to take a hold of, which is a retrospective account of history, and instead to flip the question and to provide a history of the present that holds philosophy accountable. So I think that there are different approaches to Nietzsche's politics. I'm not particularly sure if, unless you want to ground it in the will to power, which has its own problems, I think a particular affirmative politics predicated on a constitutive claim to right would be problematized, or is problematized by Nietzsche, right? Like that is part of the reason why Nietzsche is historically so negative about the socialists. So.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Well, I'll have Devin respond to that, and Justin, if you want to add anything, you can follow that up.
Well, thanks. Well, I mean, I agree that I think you're kind of delineating between two sort of strands here of how Nietzsche is received by the post-structuralists. And I guess I sort of end up feeling like they may coexist a bit uncomfortably in the account that you've given. And one is this more historical methodological strain in Foucault, which is interested in kind of the genealogical method in Nietzsche, the kind of demystifying critique of certain moral ideals that are taken to be natural in a kind of mistaken way at present. And then you have, as you said, with Deleuze and Klossowski, more of a explicit attempt to reconstruct will to power as a metaphysics, an eternal return as a metaphysics. But I think, what you've described is a bit of a tension here, right? So I do actually think that there's good reason to think that Nietzsche held some version of the eternal return as a cosmological hypothesis rather than just an ethical test. And I think, there's plenty of sketches in Nietzsche's notebooks, albeit incomplete, that represent efforts to scientifically prove the eternal recurrence. It's hard to account for sort of the genesis of the idea and his interest in proving it in that way without some kind of cosmological bite of that kind. But I do think that if you're going to get into this task of ontology and get into will to power as metaphysics or as ontology, and then you're going to be pushing the limits of a purely historicist or purely historical mode of interrogation. And I do think that's a kind of analysis of Nietzsche that makes a whole lot of sense for the genealogy. It's not necessarily the framing that I would use for a lot of the rest of his work. And I also think kind of the problem that he identifies in Birth Tragedy oppositional thinking is one aspect of it. A kind of lingering Hegelianism, as he puts it, is one aspect of it. But a misunderstanding of the Dionysian as an effort to kind of suspend life's suffering in a kind of anesthesia. Art is anesthesia. He sees that kind of Schopenhauerian model of art as too present in Birth of Tragedy and kind of clouding the form of Dionysian affirmation he's really after. So I do think that oppositional thinking has something to do with it, but I don't think it's really I'm not sure I would identify it as the defining thing that Nietzsche breaks with Birth of Tragedy on.
Great. Justin, I know you're a big reader of Foucault too. Was there anything there that you wanted to respond to?
No, I mean, not directly. I mean, in terms of like Foucault, I will, at this point, do a little bit of like tip of the hat to Will on that. But, I did want to like circle back and, just say about, yeah, exactly. Say a little bit about that question about capitalism, ressentiment, and bad conscience, and the aesthetic ideal, and it being a war machine. And I think that I just wanted to be clarifying on my end that I think that, I read through Nomadology in preparation of this because of this question. And I was like, do I even know what a war machine is? Does anyone know what a war machine is? Do Deleuze and Guattari know what a war machine is? And
that's the key question.
Yeah. So, looking back, I just wanted to make that point that I was like, it's a bit loose and free there with that idea of a war machine, but just trying to capture that idea that it is no longer just simply a Christian thing. I wouldn't want to like tie capitalism anymore to Christianity. I think that those like psychological elements are still there in it, but obviously it's sort of like off on its own now, and both in capture by the state, used by the state, and feeding the state, and reproducing these whole relationships that they talk about with the war machine. But I did want to at least like circle back and say, like, I don't think that there's still a one-to-one correspondence between Christianity and capitalism in that way.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go into the pool of questions. I'm going to pull one out, and then I'll have Adam and Will kind of like identify one that they would like to ask. But I think this is an important one to get to before we get to the sort of meatier political questions, although maybe this is the meatiest of political questions. Could you explain Nietzsche's critique of representation? And also another idea that's popped up here is this notion of oppositional thinking. That's been mentioned by Devin and Will just a few times. So Devin, maybe you can start on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think a good place to start, since we were talking about Birth of Tragedy and kind of how those themes develop throughout Nietzsche's work, is how representation functions there, and kind of use that as a jumping off point. So representation functions in Birth of Tragedy on the side of Apollo, or the Apollonian. And the idea is that the Apollonian represents, this term he takes from Schopenhauer, the sort of the principle of individuation. The world of appearances is one that gives us individual objects, individual things. Their boundaries are demarcated, and they kind of shine forth as beautiful individual forms, right, as representations. The Dionysian, by contrast, represents a kind of moment of intoxication as opposed to dream, where the boundaries between individual things flow together, everything kind of merges into a primal unity of life. And this opposition, Nietzsche identifies this as a kind of antagonism or opposition that is what essentially creates Attic tragedy in Birth of Tragedy. But he'll go on to kind of revise his conception of how each of these terms functions. And we'll come to see that the Dionysian comes to be the really all-important category for him by the end of his life. But what you see, I think, in Birth of Tragedy, and the theme that carries through his work, is Nietzsche's grappling with a kind of legacy of Kant, where we start with a kind of philosophy according to which we are given, appearances are given to intuition, right? And instead of trying to access the things in themselves, we focus on describing the transcendental conditions of possibility of how things can appear in experience. And Schopenhauer takes up this Kantian problem, and you can then see how it appears in Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche then starts to do his own thing with looking at how art and aesthetics function within how the subject, the human subject, shapes kind of the world of representation. And then in his middle work, starting to bring in kind of natural science, an account of psychology and the drives, an account of physiology, in kind of his way of understanding what I still take to be kind of Kant's transcendental. What is these kind of conditions that shape the possibility of representations as they appear to us as subjects? And I still take Nietzsche to be kind of within that framework, but having a radical, distinct idea of what kind of grounds the world of representation. And what you'll see later on is that it's ultimately going to be based on the will to power as kind of the overall unifying principle of the organic world. And we, in part, as living beings, create representations in an effort to cope with and justify suffering. This is a function of the will to power. We affirm suffering by overcoming it in a kind of representation that we can live with. And I think Nietzsche's entire view of representation has to be kind of situated in how he understands the subject as not just knowing the world, right? Not just having representations, but always having to kind of cope with and incorporate the experiences that it has, kind of live with them, build them into a kind of overall system that can allow the entity to continue to act. So representation is always based on is a product of and is based on that kind of picture of the drives and will to power in particular.
Great, thank you, Devin. Justin, I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. I wonder if you can connect this to education at all. I mean, this is, when I was thinking about Nietzsche while I was a teacher, this was a very sort of prominent philosophical theme that was at the forefront of my mind when planning lessons and things like that. Maybe you already have a comment loaded up, but perhaps you could just respond to that as well.
Yeah, I was just going to echo in like slightly different words something that Devin was saying, and I can talk about that too. But just that, when I was talking before about revenge versus attack, I think that this is a kind of a Deleuzian interpretation of Nietzsche, but in terms of this idea of representation, that is the slave's conception of power, is to have your power recognized, have it represented. And that's what for Nietzsche connects it to a ressentiment, is this, it's only this like sort of power of recognition or the content of this representation, making it into a competition, that gives, like, as Devin was saying, like this meaning, this continuing on, to give yourself that stake in the fight where, you can continue to sort of like go forward, but only through representation. And that is, I think, like the biggest trap, is trapping ourselves in that from Nietzsche's standpoint. So in terms of education in the classroom, I mean, it's definitely something I think about a lot, because even particularly like the age of the children that I'm at, they're very sort of like on the edge of like where their representation of themselves even is, let alone the rest of the world. And they're creating those things as we interact with each other through in the classroom. And, I talked about it quite a bit, I think, on the last podcast, and I would just continue to lean into the idea of like, this is where things like play and all of its forms, like, allow us to continue to experiment with those type of things, not allow ourselves to be like trapped in like a representation like that. Part of that is what you do as a teacher with the power dynamic in the classroom, like how you're able to like shield the outside power dynamic that's coming in from the state, from the administration, from the parents, how you're able to like create a new type of relationships that you can have both as the teacher with the children, but also with the children themselves. And like that to me is the type of thing that I'm thinking about when I'm talking about like doing like trainings for teachers, is like, how can we like talk about incorporating this play, dance, laughter, curriculum type of situation into the classroom and have it ward off these like, stultifying sort of like representations that they're going to, I mean, it's like, it's a battle of just epic proportions. And like, I'm just thinking about like the small part that I can do in the classroom, but that is like fundamental to the day-to-day and what we try to do, especially in my classroom.
Muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you, Justin. I'm thinking also about, what's tragically occurring in places like Florida today, where, the state intervention by the far right is now imposing upon this caricature that they've established of the teacher in the classroom and the edifice of the school itself, to the extent that it's going to impose, a kind of authority that stands to get in the way of the teacher-student relationship, which is radically different than what, like you said, like what the parents and the administration and even the state bring to the table when it comes to incorporating children into our society, or allowing them opportunities for growth and exploration. But anyway, that aside, we have Adam and Will on deck to ask a particular question. So what do you got, Adam?
Well, I'm just going to select this one from the pile because just to highlight the Oscar left Nietzschean port, but it's just I guess it's going to be one of the first questions that we'll have when we think about Nietzsche in the context of a left Nietzscheanism. And I guess if I'd like to foreground it a little bit in terms of, what did Nietzsche think a communist or particularly a socialist or an anarchist was? For a socialist, for Nietzsche, would have been someone like the notorious anti-Semite Eugen Düring, who Engels was famously sent off by Marx to go, attack in anti-Düring. A very sort of naturalistic conception of socialism, very sort of what we would now call utopian, but I would say far worse than that lot. An anarchist, I think, really for him is Pierre Joseph Proudhon, most famous for the phrase, property is theft. And in that sense, the anarchist revolution would be a rebellion against the past. It's a claiming on the debt of that theft, which I guess is probably Nietzsche's main problem with it. But there's also the question of a hidden influence on Nietzsche. And this is kind of my soapbox here, is that I think Nietzsche was very much influenced by the work of Max Stirner to some extent, mostly because he read a book that had a summary of Stirner in it, which was, this is the biggest philosopher of the will since Schopenhauer. And so I think there is actually some space of wiggle room for anarchistic tendencies in Nietzsche's work specifically, especially when you get something like Thus Spake Zarathustra, just the state as the new idol. I just wanted to sort of open this more general question in how do each of you personally think that that Nietzsche's views has this strong resonance with communist and it's not solely communist or anarchists, because we're not talking about the ANCAPs here, we're talking about goddamn communizing anarchos right here. So I just wanted to sort of throw that one out there and see what you both thought about it.
Yeah, go ahead, Devin.
All right. So I think I would take it in kind of different directions depending on whether we're talking about anarchism versus communism. Let's start with anarchism in this case. So I think one thing that's interesting about Nietzsche is that there will be some affinities, as you already noted in reference to the passage on the state and Zarathustra. There will be some affinities between anarchism and how Nietzsche thinks about the nation-state politics of his time. And I'm particularly talking about kind of the period after he's broken with Wagner and his early work and come to be disgusted with the kind of German nationalistic tendencies he's seeing around him. And I think, one influence here was Jacob Burckhardt. There is an idea that I think goes back to kind of Nietzsche's classicism of the political state as ultimately mostly concerned with violence and coercion, and therefore is antithetical in some fashion to the project of culture, which is based in some fashion upon human freedom. You can find Nietzsche saying as early as kind of his notebooks in 1869 how art demands the destruction of the state, essentially. So the complicating factor, of course, is that Nietzsche also has a metaphysics that is grounded in a concept of power, and construes not just human relationships, but organic relationships as a whole, arguably all of ontology, as kind of relationships of domination and obedience, or command and obedience. And this, we don't need to get too far into the metaphysics here, but the tension here, I think, is that Nietzsche identifies as a kind of critic of the modern state some of the same tendencies that anarchists are concerned about how the attempt to legitimize political rule through the state will ultimately result in unacceptable forms of violence, essentially, no matter what. Nietzsche can at times accepts this thesis. The problem, though, is that he has a picture of human society that can never be freed of power relationships. And I don't think this is necessarily a problem for anarchist thought. I think it's actually a kind of fertile ground for thinking about kind of the ways that Nietzsche discusses the psychology of kind of adversarial relationships, relationships of command and obedience, how they can be reversed, how their complexities. And I think there are lessons to be learned about, like, well, what would a society of mutual aid look like, granting that certain forms of conflict, certain forms of disagreement are always going to potentially arise in human relationships. There always might be destabilizing kind of power asymmetries. And I think rather than treating power, rather than a liberal thinker who treats power as primarily centered in the state, but sees power kind of like Foucault as permeating most of human social relationships, there's a great deal of reflection on how we prevent relationships of power from ossifying into unhelpful hierarchies or unfair hierarchies, and how we prevent these relationships of adversarial relationships from becoming vengeful or hateful. So yeah, how about I do the anarchist part and Justin can pick up with the communist part from here. I can come back to it too, but yeah.
All right, Justin, what do you got?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, you know, I like to take this sort of like idea of using Nietzsche from a communist standpoint, sort of like how I imagine that Nietzsche is being used by Deleuze and Guattari, especially in Anti-Oedipus, where it's like, you know, and maybe people don't disagree that, or would disagree this is what they're doing, but using Nietzsche as a knife to cut as much away that you can, that is like going to be problematic or going to not be revolutionary potential from Marx, you know, from the work of the socialists, in terms of like just whittling that down to its most effective sort of self, I guess, if we're going to be reductive about it. But, you know, I think that like even some of what Devin is talking about through the anarchists applies to the communists. I mean, if we're actually thinking about what communism might look like, I mean, we're imagining, I think, at the very least, different kinds of individuals in terms of like how we're conceiving of ourselves, how we're conceiving of other people. I know that one of the biggest sort of impediments to probably both anarchists and communists and Nietzsche coming together is this idea of hierarchies, which is very much foundational for Nietzsche's philosophy. And I think that as long as we're thinking of things as like filial hierarchies or ossified hierarchies, like he's saying, I mean, that's going to be a problem. It's a problem, I think, for Nietzsche. I think it would be for anyone who's familiar with Nietzsche's work. But if you're talking, my conception, at least, of reading through, especially the French Nietzscheans, is that, you know, it's very much like Deleuze and Guattari's rhizomatic situation, where, of course, there are going to be like power differences in those relationships. You know, I mean, to be like all Marxist about it, you know, and at some level, I think that there's like, you know, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs type of situation here, where there's a recognition that within this, like, whatever this mass of people that are getting together and working together, mutual aid, communism, whatever that is, where like some people are going to have this, some people are going to have this. These things can change, allowing those hierarchies to be like flexible, multiple, changing. Like those are the type of things where, you know, I'm far from having an idea of how we get to some sort of like Nietzschean communism and actually live that. But I think that like these type of ideas where we can borrow from Nietzsche and apply to Marx, or borrow from Marx and apply to Nietzsche, like help us get over a lot of these things that we're replicating unconsciously in our practice that we're, I mean, and I think for like Stirner, you know, it seems like one of the big differences between Stirner and Nietzsche was this idea of like, and I'm not like a Stirner expert, so I could be wrong on this, but like he's more still like the idea of what's different between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. Like, is the soul unitary or is it multiple? And for Nietzsche, it's multiple. And I think for Stirner, but certainly for Schopenhauer, it's unitary still. And then like, how does that still replicate all of these other power relationships that anarchists, communists, whoever are trying to overcome, when I think that a multiple self from a Nietzschean standpoint, is going to be provide us with more flexibility and more ability to like work towards these sort of like whatever this like communist anarchist goals look like in terms of like an actually lived life.
I think related to that, there's a picture or critique throughout Nietzsche of the utilitarian picture of the instrumentally rational self, Homo economicus, that is at the heart of kind of how capitalism conceives of subjectivity, how it conceives of reason. And I think it kind of gets back to the theme of Weber earlier with the idea of rationalization in Weber and rationalization, the transformation of processes into forms of instrumental reason was also important for Frankfurt School critical theory and is kind of a way in which it enters into Marxist thought. But I think that's one area where Nietzsche offers a powerful critique of capitalism while also offering a warning towards to socialists, where he sort of has the concern that socialism plays into a similar instrumental conception of reason as capitalism does, that is concerned primarily with a model of material happiness, these sort of like rational calculative methods for achieving it efficiently. And, the challenge to sort of differentiate kind of that conception of the self from the conception capitalism gives us. I think that's a theme that Nietzsche's grappling with throughout his work.
Great. I actually want to bring Will into this. Given that Nietzsche wrote his works in the latter portion of the 19th century, there was a particular kind of political anarchism that was prominent at that time. It's arguable that the shape of anarchism has changed. Do you think, Will, that Nietzsche's criticism of the anarchists of his time, or maybe even anarchists in general, as these kind of resentful leveling types, following the sort of herd mentality, is that an accurate characterization? Is there a form of anarchism that you think would be amenable to Nietzsche's ideas? Or is there a place, at least for a Nietzschean critique of what's happening in anarchist movements?
Amenability is an answer that I can't provide in a way that I think is meaningful for Nietzsche. But I think that when we're talking about Nietzsche's response to classical anarchism, when we're talking about Nietzsche's response to Proudhon, primarily, but also to the anarchists who would use Nietzsche, namely Emma Goldman, right? He's essentially criticizing these anarchists for taking the people that the state creates and then saying, this is the administration of things, right? Nietzsche's criticism of anarchism is precisely the account of the kind of Engelsian account of communism and, frankly, the other side of the Engelsian account of anarchism. Like, what Nietzsche is essentially criticizing is precisely the reality that most anarchists would like to see the relations and forces of production be maintained without essentially the conditions that make civil society possible in the conventional theory of the state, right? So when Nietzsche criticizes, for example, in a kind of strangely, of course, racializing kind of way, the English, right, for their account of, say, the basically Homo economicus, right, as we've been talking about. What essentially the anarchists of this period are attempting to do is to pull away the cold lie that crawls from the mouth of the state, right, that says, I am the people, right? Take the validity of the constituent force of that, reinsert it back into the people, and then say, and here, now we can be the pure administration of things. And essentially, that's a politics of reaction. It's a politics of arrogation of the state. So no, I don't think when Nietzsche's criticizing anarchists, the moralizing elements of anarchism, particularly in the gay science, it's important to keep in mind what anarchism meant, right? And we talked about this a little bit. Well, I wasn't there, but you talked about this a little bit with Catherine Malibu. I know Catherine Malibu's concept of anarchism and, say, like, mine as just a graduate student with no idea what I'm doing are different. But like, it's worth noting that Catherine Malibu can somewhat confidently say capitalism took something from anarchism, right? Capitalism has arrogated something from anarchism. And it is precisely the flipping of this constituent lie that the state makes that, in a certain sense, it relies on. I think that when we talk about the function of the state in classical anarchism, even specifically in Emma Goldman, what most classical anarchists are looking for is the rectification or the reconciliation of the failure of the state to properly administer things. That in fact, without it, the proper administration of things exists far more seamlessly. And for Nietzsche, that's the foreclosing of culture, right? So like I think for him to understand the criticism of anarchism, like it is actually quite important to understand what an anarchist meant. Also what a socialist meant. Like socialist did not mean like Karl Marx. Like it meant Ferdinand Lassalle, but even more so, it meant like early accounts of what we would now probably just call like essentially social democracy, right? Like, so when people talk about, oh, Nietzsche's critique of the socialists, Nietzsche's critique of the anarchists, these are very, very particular and politically viable political formations that existed within parliamentary politics at the time, what would become parliamentary politics at the time. They were utterable within political movements. So like to subject Nietzsche to like the anarchism of Marcello Tari or Tikkun, it would be completely like you can do it, but you have to be very careful. And I think that's when, you know, Nietzsche's, because I think you've tweeted this before, Craig. So now we're all being held accountable for our posts. You tweeted once something that still resonates with me like 3 years later. You were like, Zarathustra is an account of biopolitics. I was like, yes. Like in so many different periods or in so many different parts of that text, it is specifically an account of biopolitics, whether it's an account of the function of the press and the spectacle, or an account of the function of the itinerant life, the predictable life. So like, yeah, I think that the application of Nietzsche to anarchism, particularly in those passages in the Gay Science, like has to be done pretty carefully.
Great. I feel obliged to bring Adam in because Max Stirner was mentioned. What about the charge that Max Stirner is just a vacuous ego hole versus Nietzsche being the plentitudinous, multitudinous guy?
Max Stirner only wrote one book, and it was a particular intervention into a small bar full of arguing Hegelians, many of them whom some of them actually Nietzsche met later on, for example, David Strauss and Bruno Bauer, less Strauss in Stirner's case. It's not really a unitary ego. He just doesn't give an account of the ego. There isn't really, the ego doesn't really exist in Stirner's work. But it's mainly just the idea of refusing to give an account of yourself for the enemy, for someone, so that they can therefore impose a kind of debt upon you. The idea of Stirner is that, you know, there's not so much revenge for Stirner. That's why he critiques Proudhon as well. I mean, Stirner and Nietzsche have some severe differences. I mean, the only sort of real clear unity of the two is really one in Das Buch Zarathustra, when Nietzsche is writing about the virtuous, and he says, oh, these people who are so virtuous and moralizing, they just want to get paid. And this is a critique of Kant as well, the idea that in order for moral action to be possible, whilst you can't do it for the sake of, you know, you can't do it for the sake of reward, it has to be done purely out of goodwill. Nonetheless, in order to do it out of goodwill, you have to presuppose an immortal soul and freedom and God, as not as actual things, but as things you have to presuppose in order to act morally. So there's an overlap there. Yeah.
Great. Will, what was the question that you had on deck?
Let me open my questions real quick.
Okay, go for it.
The question that I have on deck here is actually related to the question of representation, but a very different kind of representation. How would a so-called left Nietzschean respond to Nietzsche's continuous critique of democracy? Does a left Nietzschean have any commitments to democracy as an institution? And I think that Tronti wrote a famous essay on democracy, biopolitics, and Nietzsche that always rings in my head whenever I see a question like this. So maybe we'll open with Justin this time on the political, and then see if maybe there are sparks that fly there.
I'll just say no and then mute myself. I do not have any commitments to democracy as an institution. No, I will say a little bit more. But I mean, I think that is it's difficult. Just because, just going back to what, what we were talking about with Adam, I mean, there are so many commitments that one has to make to one's views about all these different types of things to think about participating, especially in like a liberal democracy, that we have right now. That being said, I mean, I think that, there's a wide variety of ways that you can take Nietzsche and apply him. I mean, I've certainly read and enjoyed things on Nietzsche and democracy, like just about talking about the agon and like bringing that into democracy, and like how this contestation of views is important and is a very Nietzschean concept. And I think that those things are fair and valid. And I mean, I will admit that I go vote in elections, and you know what I mean? I think that there's there's no reason as a left Nietzschean, if that's what I'm going to call myself, to be on principle opposed to political acts within a democratic institution. But I mean, I think that when I'm thinking about being on the left as a Nietzschean, it's more like communism. It's more like anarchy as opposed to democracy. I do think that there are so many just irredeemably problematic issues with the sort of liberal democracy that we're talking about that we have in the States or in Western Europe. I mean, I can think of, can we define democracy as something like, a communist mutual aid situation? I think that that's possible. But I would, overall, I think that I would always say that you can take what you want from Nietzsche, little bits or a lot, and you can apply that how is best to you in your particular situation. And, I think that can be done and still consider yourself like a liberal Democrat who is looking to ward off the real actual evils of the right, as we've talked about before. And that's important and a bulwark in some way. But I think that it becomes very difficult to take even more than a little bit of Nietzsche's critique seriously and also be I'm committed to democracy as an institution. I think that is a difficult place for myself to stand in. So I'll yield on that one.
All right, I'll bite that bullet. Let's do the Nietzschean defense of democracy here. So let's say, so when it comes to saying, what does a left Nietzschean think? I mean, I would not consider myself a left Nietzschean, in part because I don't think there's really any such thing as a Nietzschean as such. I think that if you're thinking about things that way, you're responding to Nietzsche's work kind of in the wrong way already, as kind of giving you a philosophy you can subscribe to. But as somebody who's very interested in Nietzsche and is working on Nietzsche and also considers myself to be politically on the left, I can say, yes, I think that the left should have commitments to democracy as an institution, and also particularly should have a commitment to not running it together with liberalism into the combination of liberal democracy, but to continuing to tease them apart as principles. And this is somewhere where Nietzsche has proven very important for democratic theory over the past, several decades. Justin alluded to some of these theories of agonistic democracy. In Bonnie Honig, you get an idea of Nietzsche as providing us with a model of kind of unruly, disruptive, creative freedom that creates kind of productive adversarial encounters in democracy. And the target is kind of a Habermas-inspired idea of deliberative democracy, where we all kind of sit down and legitimize power by talking about our principles and what ought to be done. This is the Nietzschean model comes in to provide an idea of democracy as grounded in contestation, as in disruption, and particularly disruption of, what constitutes kind of the idea of the good life or the morally right that at any given time might be ideologically governing the decisions of a particular, state. Then you also get kind of theories of Nietzschean democratic theory that's a little more focused on the ethics of the self, someone like William Connolly. And here the idea is that there's a philosophy of becoming and difference that affirms the plurality of identity, that recognizes that all identity is relational and constituted through some relationship to exteriority to the other. And reading, fascism and certain forms of like aggressive right-wing philosophy as attempts to create a stabilized, closed identity that is unaffected by difference. And Connolly presents Nietzsche as giving us rather a kind of robust ethics of difference for situating and criticizing our identities in a democratic setting defined by pluralism. It is very clearly true that Nietzsche is an extremely sharp critic of leveling tendencies in democracy. He's a critic of equal rights. And he seems to oftentimes endorse hierarchy as something that's valuable even in itself. But I think the right way to view this is that in many cases, Nietzsche is picturing any relationship of hierarchy as unstable and multiple, as always involving multiple relationships of command and obedience. In the sense, we're always both commanding and obeying at the same time. And this is not actually that dissimilar to sort of the idea of democracy in classical Athens, of ruling and being ruled in turn and constantly having to negotiate this problem of rule without appeal to some kind of single person or institution that we can give up our right to command and obey to and build a consensus around. So I actually still think that I would argue that Nietzsche not only has valuable resources for democratic theory still to offer, but I think that his critique of equality under democracy, of leveling tendencies under democracy, I think that's a point where we should part ways with Nietzsche, while also recognizing it as a formidable challenge to how we're accustomed to thinking about morality and how we're usually used to grounding the conceptions of rights that we do appeal to in democratic settings.
Great. Does anybody want to respond to that or add on?
I think it's also worth adding on, especially what we're saying about the idea of a left Nietzscheanism is it's fundamentally less of an ideology or a system, in the sense of, as you said, you subscribe to it. We go, I've read all these books. I think all these positions are 1, coherent, 2, unified, 3, I can identify with them. I can identify as a practitioner of them, and then apply them, because that would be formalistic. If anything, it seems to me what we've been talking about today is that it's a strategy of reading and a strategy of thinking with and alongside, rather than placing Nietzsche as the kind of the director, the intellectual cadre who from whom the themes and the ideas simply descend and we are to apply them. No, it's a strategy. It's a strategy because he has a certain tendency to identify certain weak points. Otherwise, it would be things like to be like a Hegelian. You go through the encyclopedia, because the system for Hegel, it ends up being a textbook. You read through that, you go, yep, okay, I've come out the system, I've been processed through its sort of churn, and now my idea is to simply, I'm now free to go replicate that system or replicate the logic of that system in the present day. This is what he says at the end of his lectures on history. He says, go bring the spiritual daylight of the present, go reveal, go forth and multiply, I guess, or go forth and be singularly Hegelian. And I think it's very much worth thinking about, because as a strategy, it's notoriously, or rather the benefit, it's piecemeal. If you had to take any of this as particularly gospel, or as entirely interlinked in a systemic manner, like you get with someone like Kant or someone like Hegel, it would be, of course, totally pointless, because it would all simply be intersecting parts of each other, including the worst bits. I mean, we've had people like Martin Riehl and Robert Bernasconi talking about, for example, the racial themes in Nietzsche, the themes of anti-blackness, very prevalent in his interests in 19th century Germany. It isn't to say that it should be ignored, but it's about taking a strategy for identifying the links between those parts of his philosophy and then seeing what parts can still be useful. It's more like a toolkit than a textbook, let's say. I think that's still the model here, the strategy of reading. Because for example, the question would be also, why did Klosowski? Why did Bataille? Why were all these sort of French resistance anti-fascists? Why were they looking to Nietzsche? Why were they saying, like, you can't have this guy? This guy has insights which are a bit too valuable for us to surrender them to the Germans, essentially, to the fascisti. And that is something really worth going for, that, because there's something which he gets at the psychoanalytic, or at least the proto-psychoanalytic bend of thinking about how people get these reified ideas, how people get these ideas of revenge, how people get caught in these infinite cycles of debt to the past, which don't allow them to think about the future. I don't know how much Nietzsche is a thinker of debt in regards to the future. So far, we know from Nietzsche's work is that, Nietzsche doesn't like this idea of indebtedness to the past. This idea of indebtedness to the past is what creates these grand ideals like God or history, which you are meant to serve and are not meant to have any sort of creative, affirmative play within. Instead, maybe Nietzsche would think about the debt we have to the future, and in that case, you can make a Nietzschean point for, again, retaliation, or as someone's saying in the chat, or attack rather than revenge. What if, for example, the idea of destroying the systems that have destroyed the whole of humanity? Liberal capitalism is driving us into global climate catastrophe. What if we destroyed them not out of a spiteful sort of attempt to undo that past, but rather for the sake of the future instead? A debt to the future, a creative debt, rather than a debt to simply negate the past.
Great. Will, do you have anything before we go on to the next question?
I do. I want to touch on democracy's leveling tendencies, because I don't really think that, like, disciplinary power as we understand it and biopolitics as we understand it is possible without democratization and without leveling. For me, like, a Nietzschean approach to democracy, like, it can't work. For me, it can't work precisely because democracy is predicated on a production of equality that actually just means replaceability and producibility of constituencies, people. For me, it comes down to what Stuart Kendall said in his account of Bataille, where for Bataille, what Nietzsche unlocks is the absolute irreplaceability of human existence within the political. And what democracy attempts to do is to establish a norm as a virtual and then perpetually try to realize it as an actualized legislated effective politics. So for me, that's kind of the limit of democracy is precisely the leveling down. Because I think in a certain sense, Karl Marx is right when he says that, democracy is the perfection of the art of the state. Then beyond that, the Invisible Committee, to our friends, corrects that vision and says, no, in fact, democracy is the perfection of the art of governance. That in fact, it's governance that sits at the core of democracy. So I really like the use of leveling in the discussion, because I think precisely that's where the limit is. But I know we have one more kind of complicated question, kind of contemporary question about Nietzsche and Nietzsche scholarship that perhaps people are finally ready for.
Oh, I forgot about that question. Actually, let's do that question real quick. It's about Domenico Losurdo.
Oh, we're doing Losurdo now? Okay.
Let's just do it. Yeah. I wanted to get on to the more fun stuff, but let's just take care of the laundry here. What is your opinion of the work of Domenico Losurdo and his critique of Nietzsche? And we'll start with Devin, because I know you've been looking at it quite a bit.
Yeah, I've been working through this book quite recently and kind of intensified that effort as I learned that you guys were interested in discussing it on the pod today. I think that I'm gonna try to give the brief version of what was originally a lengthy takedown of this book. But I think that the theoretical benefit of Losurdo's 1,000-page historical inquiry into Nietzsche's, biography, in effect, would be to enrich our understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy by situating him in a complex historical and political context that may go missing, particularly from analytic philosophers' accounts of Nietzsche, right? What we actually get is a Nietzsche, I think, that gets pretty much completely dissolved into that historical context, who loses his distinctiveness as a thinker. And also where we lose, I think, any real sense of why we would write the 1,000-page book on Nietzsche to begin with, what it is that's valuable in his philosophy that would drive somebody who is on the left, a Marxist, to study this thinker, right? And I think that, when you're looking at Losurdo's book, I mean, if you're starting it, don't expect to learn anything about Nietzsche from a philosophical standpoint. In fact, he's very quickly kind of expresses mystification or kind of throws his hands up at the effort to make sense of Nietzsche's commitments. I mean, starting in the first chapter with Birth of Tragedy, on philosophical grounds, on aesthetic or artistic grounds, on biographical or psychological grounds. So I think it's important to see Losurdo's book as rejecting, in many ways, kind of out of hand, the idea that we can take approaches to understanding the unity of Nietzsche's work from a philosophical standpoint, from the standpoint of his life, from the standpoint of artistic or cultural concerns. For Losurdo, it is really this political project, this reactionary, radical, aristocratic political project that is the defining kind of unifying theme of Nietzsche's work. And I think the problem here is not that we won't recognize this kind of politics in Nietzsche. We obviously will. And we don't have to dig far in Nietzsche's unpublished fragments in order to find it either, right? But the kind of conventional or common sense picture we're going to get is that Nietzsche's work was defined by a complex set of motives that included his philosophical concerns, included ideas of a kind of grand collective artistic project, and it included political concerns. And the question is why we should reject, I think, that more common sense picture of Nietzsche in favor of what is really a really harder historical reductionist view. And I think what you see when you get into Losurdo is you actually have to accept a series of pretty questionable assumptions interpretively in order to really get there with him. You have to assume not only that the unpublished fragments are important, but in some sense that's where the real philosophy is done, and that the published work is even as far as a facade of some sort, kind of covering up his more radical agenda. We're asked to essentially dismiss many of Nietzsche's own kind of stated concerns for how he wants his own philosophy to be read, whether this is in Ecce Homo, whether this is his characterizations of himself as untimely. And we're essentially given a series of historical analogs that allow us to triangulate Nietzsche relative to a reactionary politics of his time. And I think at the end of the day, he has this critique of the hermeneutics of innocence. What we get in Losurdo is more a hermeneutics of paranoid guilt. Instead of a real effort to grapple with what in Nietzsche's philosophy might lead him to these views, he is triangulated in relation to other thinkers of his time. And we are left with a kind of old style reactionary politics that leaves us wondering why we should be reading Nietzsche or what Nietzsche has to contribute in the first place. And I think this is why the book kind of fails to stage the confrontation that it wants to stage, which is to say, well, Nietzsche represents a formidable political challenge to the left, and particularly the Marxist left. I mean, I think this is an animating idea of the book, is to uncover what that challenge is. And I think we don't find a formidable challenge from Losurdo's account of Nietzsche. We find a rather weak one. And we also lose any real sense of what philosophical motivations might have led Nietzsche there. And that's also why we might want to consider, his philosophical arguments rather than seeing him as emblematic of his time. I don't think it's a very good book. I think there's a lot of rich historical detail. I don't think you'll actually learn much about Nietzsche by reading it.
Thanks. Justin, have you engaged with Losurdo's work at all?
A little bit, mostly for this, and I will make one singular joke, and then I will also say a couple things. But my joke is that if you're writing a 1,000-page book that you're then selling for $500 approximately upon publication, and then you're telling me that you're anti-aristocratic, I'm going to pause and wonder who you're writing this book for, because it seems like it might be aristocratic Marxists. And that is my joke about why I can be very dismissive of Losurdo at the outset. But I mean, I think that Devin is right in all of that, and like how he's flattening Nietzsche. And I think that there's a real, issue here that I don't have time to get into, but like about the flattening and like the just like sucking all of the juice out of the concept for Nietzsche, by Losurdo, where they're just like, And then I would also say that I think that like if you take Nietzsche seriously and you take his critique seriously and you want to meet him on his own terms, you have to, I think, admit that he is in fact innocent in some way that Losurdo would like him not to be. Not that he is meek and mild or doesn't have problematic views, but that his, you know, he is telling you that like he is multiple. These things are, you know, I mean, like he's claiming to be something that Losurdo will not engage with, and then Losurdo is just saying that he is this other thing. And I think that, as Devin has pointed out, you know, very accurately, like we could have had something quite, you know, I mean, there's critiques to make.
Yeah, there's something interesting that could happen here.
Yeah, but it's not this book, and I hate to say it, but I think it's just not a very good book and not a very well written book. So, no, I have not read all 1,000 pages. So.
I mean, there's something to be said for the hermeneutics of innocence, at least. I mean, in terms of sort of any sort of philosophical or struggle between, you know, if there's going to be influences or philosophical groundings for a kind of Marxist or genuinely communist materialist politics, you know, how innocently are we reading those influences? And, you know, I'm just going to, you know, for example, how innocently, for example, is someone like Hegel treated? I mean, Hegel is, you know, he's the grounding system here, but, you know, he's given quite a lot of benefit of the doubt. I mean, I'm assuming that's fine, because I'm just going to pick up the philosophy of mind here and never mind. Never mind. There's nothing innocent in there.
Hold the fort.
Oh boy. Well then, shall
can we talk about though the function of Losurdo's actual critique, which like is to also delegitimize the new left? Like that's what this is also functioning to do, which is essentially like we put so much pressure on the word aristocrat when I think Losurdo kind of wants to put pressure on the word rebel. Like that's the problem. Yeah. Are these rebellious queers and their weird theories, and they don't want to apprehend the state. They're not good Lukácians who are going to delete that passage like Lukács did from History and Class Consciousness. They're these filthy, lumpen, PMC, you know, disaffected sons of petty bourgeois peddlers, this and that. I mean, Losurdo himself shouldn't be taken fucking seriously. Like, I mean, so it's remarkable to me that this is a theorist who can write the Black Legend of Stalin and then at the same time provide a remarkably like I've only read the sections of this book that deal with Deleuze and Foucault. So like I don't quite know or really care. Like I'm shocked. Nietzsche had horrendous views about things. But it's the accounts of Foucault and Deleuze that I found insulting. I mean, insultingly bad scholarship, ridiculously terrible summaries of the birth of biopolitics. Society must be defended. He doesn't understand the basics of the text he's reading because he's not engaging with them philosophically.
No, you get very strange moves where, you know, we like the first chapter is focusing on Birth of Tragedy, and instead of actually digging in at all to the text of Birth of Tragedy, we learn, well, in order to make sense of this, we have to go to this remark Marx made one time about Malthus, and this is somehow going to unlock the secret of what Nietzsche has to say. There's just a great deal of rhetorical dishonesty there, I think, when he kind of expresses a mystification about what the underlying texts mean that, you know, isn't quite plausible. There's a lot more going on there that you can get from the text without having to situate than he's admitting.
Yeah, and I think this strategy gets recapitulated in the work of someone like Jan Raymond, who I read a little bit last year, kind of in the same way that Will had read Losurdo, looking for the mentions of Deleuze and Foucault, and it seems as if the primary motivation is to deactivate the influence of those figures against the fallen hegemony of Marxism, which, I mean, I think is quite odd because, I mean, when you look at Deleuze and Guattari, they themselves are self-identified Marxists, and they, you know, want to be an extension of that tradition in some way, and it seems rather unusual to me. But with that said, we've given Losurdo his due today. Shall we move on? Here's a question that I think is interesting. What are some of Nietzsche's ideas you don't like and why? And I haven't spoken too much on this episode, haven't really revealed my hand, but I'll say that recently I've been going back through the gay science. And I think I told you, Devin, that like the gay science was like number 3 on my like top 10 list. I think it's number 1 now. I've been going back through it and I've just been very inspired by the reading of it. However, I've been thinking in the vein of, like, I'm thinking about aesthetics right now, the concept of beauty, and, trying to get a little writing project going. So whenever Nietzsche mentioned something about beauty, it kind of hit me a little bit differently this time. And I don't want to say that this is something that I don't expressly like, but it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And maybe you could help me work through it somewhat. Well, one of the things that's difficult to stomach when you read Nietzsche are, what seem to be, the things about anti-Blackness, or, the things that he says about women, which are sometimes meant to be ironic, other times reflect what seems to be the bigotry of that age. And the other times are maybe profound. And I think, the way in which he sees the lack of equality between the sexes or genders, if you will, as a way in which to describe how the masculinism tends to overcode or consume what's different about femininity. And there's a particular line, I think it's in book 4 of The Gay Science, and it seems like a grace note in the whole of the text, but Nietzsche's talking about the very rarity of beauty. And I don't have it next to me right now, but Nietzsche talks about being in the exact spot at the exact moment, looking at the clouds break and seeing the mountaintops. And, life is filled with these moments, where we feel this kind of rapturous beauty, and they're so rare. And that's a lot like femininity. And it makes me think, against my reading of somebody like James Hillman, the post-Jungian, who's, very much influenced by Carl Jung and Freud, how Hillman makes a distinction between spirit and soul. And there's a way in which that my prejudice towards Hillman's views here and reading them against Nietzsche, it makes me wonder whether or not, and I know this is one of our questions coming up, we're going to talk about Nietzsche's madness. I wonder if there was a kind of psychological imbalance, and I hate to put it that way, or at least there's a kind of there was a way in which Nietzsche did not allow himself a certain kind of rapture. Maybe that experience was rare against this sort of striving, sort of Übermensch mentality, the becoming the autonomous creator. What is it like? Is there a side to our soul? Is there a side to our being as human beings that that craves to be enveloped in a certain way? That beauty is almost anarchic. It does come it does come upon us quite suddenly, quite sporadically, and it does enrapture us. And if that is the case, is there something that we can do aesthetically to develop that tendency, or to propagate those opportunities? And I'm wondering what you thought of that, perhaps before we get into what it is that you don't like about Nietzsche.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head where, when you ask somebody what they don't like about Nietzsche, in general, the views about women and the race science and views about race are going to be, at the top of everyone's mind. But I think you're actually getting at what is an important tension, and I think an illuminating one, in Nietzsche's aesthetics and views about art that does map on to his views about gender, his views about relationships between men and women. And I do think biographically, we know that, there was a time in his life, kind of shortly before he met Lou Salome, where he did see love as a kind of ideal form of rapture that he desired for himself, and then ultimately failed to achieve, right? And you can, there's on a certain reading, you can view Nietzsche's, writings on women after this period as, him trying to cope with the disappointment and bitterness of rejection. But of course, there's a great deal more going on. But I think the passage that jumps out at me that's interesting is towards the end of Twilight of the Idols, where he's going back to a discussion of the Dionysian Apollonian. And he's sort of reflecting back on the kind of opposition and birth of tragedy. And he reverses course and suggests the possibility of associating the Dionysian with the side of the eternal feminine in mythology, which of course then has all of its own problems of kind of putting forth this pure kind of ideal of woman, that he's kind of abstractly negating some of his misogyny elsewhere. But I think the image that's actually really interesting is pregnancy. And this is an image or metaphor that will repeatedly come up in Nietzsche's work as a metaphor for the process of artistic creation, but also a description of a kind of will to power, where the emphasis is no longer on the moment of acting per se, but on the moment of enduring, of overcoming a process of suffering for the sake of creation, right? And that pregnancy birth as a certain kind of Dionysian power, I think, brings Nietzsche up in some ways against the limits of a lot of the masculine orientation in the rest of his work. I think it forces us to challenge the priority he affords to certain masculine virtues of strength and aggression as kind of defining how we ought to picture will to power in kind of its paradigmatic instances. So I do think that's like an area where a kind of imminent critique of Nietzsche that's both based on his philosophy and kind of biography is possible.
Great. Is there anything that you wanted to add? Maybe you had something in mind before we move to Justin, something that you didn't like. I didn't want to color your response.
No, you're fine. I think we can go ahead and turn it over to Justin. I don't want to dominate the discussion.
Thank you. Justin, is there something that you don't vibe with in Nietzsche?
Well, I mean, like, I think that, like, the first thing that you think about, I mean, for me, is certainly the more less easily read as metaphor stuff on slavery, the less easily read as metaphor stuff on women are certainly like two of the big problematic things. I think that, to go back to what you were talking about too, and I think maybe moving into this idea of his madness thing, I think that, I mean, if you take Lasowski seriously, which, like, you know, he's definitely his interpretation of Nietzsche, I think that as he moves through his life and as he starts, there's the, like, after the eternal return occurrence, and then there's the pre-eternal return occurrence for Nietzsche. And I think that, like, you know, there's this lifelong, maybe even struggle of keeping together his lucidity, you know, and sort of like, I think that you could see in some of his earlier work, like this idea of like that lucidity, that oneness being broken apart by like beauty or something like that, being more problematic or more something that he would turn away from, as opposed to later on post eternal return and his reckoning with it, and as he begins to sort of like unwind or come apart depending on you know, your perspective on reading what happens to him. But I don't want to take up too much time because I would like to talk about that, and I only have a few more minutes here, so.
Sure. Yeah. And I just want to say thank you to both of you for coming on the show. This was a phenomenal conversation. If you're listening and you've stayed with us the whole time and you don't know us, support us at Horizon. We have links in the link tree there. And we always give little gifts to our guests and stuff. So if you help us out, we help them out too. So with that said, let's move on to what is our last question. And I think this was my question, actually. Is there anything within or lacking within Nietzsche's philosophy which in any sense adequately or even partly explains his breakdown at Turin? And Devin, you said that you're doing some work on this.
Yeah, the current project that I'm working on is really focused on Nietzsche's madness and also his lifelong experience of sickness, and situating his philosophy as a kind of active process of struggling with that sickness and a kind of quest for health or convalescence. These are themes that are persistent throughout his work. There are also themes that come up very strongly in Ecce Homo, where he's kind of going back in a retrospective and trying to bring his books into a kind of unity based on how they fit in his life narrative. And so I think, you know, the short answer for me is that I do think that Nietzsche's madness is a theme that is present throughout his life, and that we can't assign a clean break with the breakdown in Turin, or really kind of stabilize the diagnosis by saying, well, it was syphilis and there was kind of a decisive moment where he descended into madness. You know, regardless of what else we take that diagnosis to be, you know, there's strong evidence that Nietzsche struggled with both major depressive episodes and episodes of manic euphoria throughout his life. You know, the way he describes his own experience of discovering the eternal return has a great deal of the kind of language that you will hear from manic psychotics. And even his friends were kind of aware of this, would talk about the contrast between two Nietzsches, where he would be kind of his normal affable self, and then he would slip into this kind of deeper, more sacred tone where he felt that he was kind of trying to convey something incredibly profound. And I take this as kind of like a kind of split that he is experiencing as a result of his his experience of madness. And I think that you can see this kind of tension between a perspective of sickness and depression and a perspective of health and joy, and Nietzsche's ability to occupy both of these perspectives and kind of see them in their contrast and in their oppositions. This is something I think is kind of pervades his entire thought and can be used as a fruitful framing for approaching his work.
Great. Justin, do you have anything to add before we close it out?
Yeah, just that I think that like having read recently Pierre Klossowski's Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, if you're interested in like a Nietzschean reading of Nietzsche's sort of disillusion of his self and what that and how the euphoria at Turin relates to his philosophy, like he goes into great detail there. But I just think that generally speaking, his argument is such that like this was a path that Nietzsche was on in terms of like listening to his body, hearing like the forces that were animating him, producing him. And this was like a long-term thing that ended with the euphoria at Turin instead of not connected at all to his philosophy. I mean, I think that like this dissolution of the self, this like creeping in of chaos and sort of unearthing that chaos underneath the self was very much, part of his work from early on. And, relating that to his breakdown, I think, instead of like necessarily like giving it a biological reading like syphilis or something like that is important to do. It's important to take seriously what Nietzsche took seriously about his breakdown, that it was evidence that, he was coming to some sort of like truth that his body was revealing to him about his particular nature. So.
Great. Once again, Justin, Devin, you guys are awesome. We'll definitely have you back on again at some point. This was a great time, and we want to extend our appreciation for you sharing your time with us this late spring.
Of course, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. This was a great discussion.
All right.
Thank you so much, guys.